He slapped her across the face in front of 200 people while she was 6 months pregnant with his child. The sound cut through the ballroom like something irreversible. It was sharp, flat, final. The kind of sound that makes everyone present understand, in a single breath, that something has just happened that can never be undone. Carter Whitmore III didn't flinch after he did it. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't even look surprised by himself. He simply adjusted his jacket, turned back toward the podium, and resumed his speech about legacy as if he had only brushed lint from his sleeve. No one moved. 200 of Houston's most powerful people stood frozen in a ballroom that cost more for one night than most families would see in a year. Investors, executives, board members, political donors, men in black tie and women in couture gowns, all holding crystal glasses, all suddenly studying the silence as though silence itself had become the most dangerous thing in the room. Diane Whitmore, Carter's mother, stood near the stage in an ivory dress, her face unreadable, her champagne flute perfectly steady in her hand. Rebecca Lane, Carter's lobbyist, and the woman whose photograph lived on his second phone, sat near the back and looked away too quickly. And Priya Anand Whitmore, carrying his child, wearing the simple dress Diane had already criticized for not being grand enough for the room, stood exactly where she had been standing when he struck her. She did not cry. She did not leave. She did not say a word. What no one in that room knew, what Carter Whitmore had never once thought to question, was that the woman he had just humiliated in front of his investors was the majority owner of his company. Not symbolically, not emotionally, legally. Every share, every mineral field, every strategic holding, every quiet acre and buried asset connected to the empire the Whitmores called theirs was, in the end, controlled by her. It had been built that way long before Carter ever learned how to say her name. Protected through layers of trusts, acquisition vehicles, shell entities, and legal structures designed by a man who had spent his life understanding the value of being underestimated. Priya's father had built that structure with patient genius. Carter had married into it without ever realizing he was the outsider. This is not only the story of a man who publicly disgraced his wife. It is the story of what happens when the quietest person in the room has spent years letting everyone else mistake silence for weakness. The story began decades earlier, not with a dramatic speech or a grand ambition, but with the kind of silence that often hides the most dangerous intelligence. In 1982, Rajan Anand arrived in Houston at 26 years old with an engineering degree from IIT Madras, $40 folded inside a money belt, and a mind so disciplined that most people around him would spend the next 40 years misreading it. He was not charming in the American sense. He did not tell stories about himself. He did not sell a vision. He did not enter rooms trying to be remembered. He entered them to understand what everyone else was missing. He rented a modest apartment in Southwest Houston. He worked. He listened. He studied land maps and lease records and geological surveys with the kind of concentration that makes ordinary people uncomfortable. His first major acquisition was a parcel of mineral rights in the Permian Basin, land other buyers dismissed because the surface geology was inconclusive and the asking price seemed irrational. Rajan paid it without argument. He did not explain himself to anyone. He filed the paperwork under Anand Holdings LLC, went home, sat at his kitchen table, and updated the legal pad he kept there every Sunday evening. That legal pad became the private map of his empire. One acquisition at a time, one note at a time, one silent correction to the world's assumptions at a time, Rajan Anand built wealth so vast that by the time people began to suspect he was rich, They were already years too late to understand how rich. By 2003, Whitmore Energy Group, one of those old Texas oil companies held together by inheritance, reputation, and leverage, was in trouble. Carter Whitmore II, father of the man Priya would later marry, needed capital badly enough to panic, but not humbly enough to admit it. Banks had become cautious. Public markets would ask too many questions. Then a private investment vehicle called Meridian Basin Partners appeared, with clean capital and favorable terms. Carter II signed. He never bothered to ask who ultimately stood behind Meridian Basin Partners, because men like him rarely ask questions when money arrives dressed the way they like. The capital was real. The paperwork was flawless. The crisis passed. That was enough for him. Meridian Basin Partners was one of several entities Rajan Anand controlled for exactly that reason. Through a series of carefully timed acquisitions, structured just below disclosure thresholds, Rajan increased his position year after year. No single move was loud enough to attract the kind of attention that might provoke resistance. He understood systems. He understood vanity. He understood that the best way to gain power over proud men is to let them believe they are too important to be vulnerable. By the time Whitmore Energy might have noticed what was happening, it was already over. Rajan held controlling interest, quietly, legally, completely. He never introduced himself to the Whitmores. He never attended shareholder banquets. He never once corrected the mythology of who really held their future in his hands. He continued to update his legal pad on Sunday nights and say nothing. His daughter knew. Priya was 17 when her father sat her down at the kitchen table and slid that legal pad across to her. He didn't give speeches. He didn't say this with pride or affection or any dramatic sense of legacy. He said it the way an engineer explains load-bearing limits. Because someone responsible needs to understand the structure before the pressure comes. You should understand what we hold, he told her. She read every line. She asked 2 questions, both technical, both exactly right. Rajan studied her for a moment, then said the thing she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Never show the whole hand. Let them underestimate the cards. She first understood what he meant when she was 14. He had taken her to a meeting in a conference room high above Westheimer Road. 3 men in expensive suits spent nearly an hour speaking to him with the polished patience of men who believed they were educating someone smaller than themselves. They quoted undervalued numbers. They spoke with the false ease of people who think the room belongs to them. Rajan listened without interrupting. His hands rested flat on the table. He did not fidget. He did not defend himself. He let them finish building their own illusion. Then he waited a few seconds. Not many. Just enough. Then he slid a single page across the table. The room changed instantly. Not dramatically. Not loudly. The shift was quieter than that. It was the soundless rearrangement that happens when reality enters a room already full of performance. The number on the page was not what they expected. The documentation behind it was airtight. The confidence drained out of them without ever announcing its departure. The meeting had been scheduled for 2 hours. It ended in 12 minutes. On the elevator down, Priya asked, "That was it?" Her father looked at her. That was it. Even then, she understood something important. She had not watched a negotiation. She had watched the moment after the negotiation had already been won. Everything before that was just the other side talking too long. Rajan protected his daughter with the same precision he used to protect everything else of value. He established the Anand Family Trust under structures designed specifically to keep its holdings as Priya's separate property before any future marriage. It was insulated, layered, and legally protected by Meera Shah, an attorney Rajan trusted because she was not sentimental, not warm, not theatrical, only exact. Meera Shah's office on McKinney Avenue said nothing flashy on the directory. Shaw and Associates. That was all. She had been Rajan's counsel for years, and Rajan valued in her what he valued in steel: reliability under pressure. Priya went to the University of Texas and studied petroleum engineering. Rajan responded to the choice with a single nod, which, for him, was practically applause. She graduated understanding reservoir characteristics, extraction models, pressure behavior, and asset valuation. She understood the ground before she fully understood the scale of what lay beneath her own life. She met Carter Whitmore III at an industry conference in Dallas when she was 32. He was everything her father was not, and at first she mistook that contrast for balance. Carter was broad-shouldered, handsome, easy in his confidence, the kind of man who had grown up moving through wealth the way fish move through water, without ever noticing it was there because he had never lived without it. He filled rooms with ease. He spoke as though the future naturally leaned toward him. And on that first night, he listened to Priya with what looked like real interest. He leaned in when she spoke. He asked follow-up questions. He seemed impressed by her mind. He knew her father's name and said it with respect. That mattered to her more than it should have. People always say women ignore the warning signs because they want romance too badly. That's not always true. Sometimes they miss the signs because the beginning is not fake. Sometimes the beginning is real. Sometimes a man does admire you, until admiration starts to feel too much like comparison. Carter courted her with warmth, attention, and a kind of easy public devotion that made her feel, in the beginning, genuinely seen. He introduced her to people with pride. He told colleagues she was brilliant. He held her hand in public like it was instinct. He made her laugh. In the early version of himself, there was tenderness in him. That was what made what came later so difficult to explain to people who only knew the ending. They married 11 months later in Houston. At the wedding, Rajan shook Carter's hand and said, "Take care of what you've been given." Carter assumed he meant Priya. He did. But he meant more than that, and Carter did not yet have the imagination to hear it. 3 months after the wedding, Rajan Anand suffered a stroke in his office and died the same evening. Priya was with him at the hospital. She held his hand. She did not cry until later, alone in the parking structure, with the engine running and the radio off. Even then, the grief came like something she was allowing herself only briefly. Her father had not raised her to perform emotion for an audience, not even an audience of one. 6 days after the funeral, Meera Shah delivered the trust documents. Priya sat at her father's desk and read every page. It took hours. There were codes, entities, valuations, transfer mechanisms, protective instruments, holdings spread across states and countries. And at the back, tucked into a final envelope, was an old business card from Chennai, yellowing at the edges, Rajan's name in plain black type on the front. On the back, in his own careful handwriting, were 4 words. Not yet, but soon. She stared at them for a long time. She put the card in the inner pocket of her coat and carried it there for years. She did not show Carter. She did not show anyone. In those early months after her father's death, Carter was still kind enough that hope remained possible. He brought her tea when she read. He made room for her sadness without demanding it become smaller on his schedule. He told people she was brilliant. He said it like he meant it. What Priya did not yet understand was that Carter's admiration had conditions. It flourished when her intelligence made him look sophisticated. It dimmed when her intelligence made him feel less necessary. The shift was slow. That is how real damage usually happens, not in a single dramatic instant, but in tiny erosions the heart keeps excusing because each individual one seems survivable. The first dinner where something changed was during the second year of their marriage. They were with executives from a pipeline development firm, and the conversation turned technical. Priya offered a precise observation about lateral well spacing in the Delaware Basin. One of the executives stopped and asked where she had studied. Carter laughed lightly and said, "She just reads a lot." Then he changed the subject. It was a small thing. So small that to mention it would sound almost foolish. Priya let it pass. She reached for her water glass and told herself not everything needs to become meaning. But small things repeated long enough become structure. His mother, Diane, entered the marriage the way slow poison enters blood. Quietly, regularly, with perfect manners. Diane Whitmore was one of those women who moved through family as if it were an executive territory she had been appointed to manage. She came to Sunday lunches with a smile sharp enough to qualify as polished. She inspected the home without looking like she was inspecting it. She delivered criticism in tones so measured they almost counted as civility. "That color is interesting on you," she once said of a dress Priya wore. The pause before interesting did all the work. She referred to Priya in private as Carter's international project. Not to her face, never that directly. Women like Diane understand power well enough to know that the most effective insult is the one that arrives secondhand, already softened by someone else's discomfort. Priya heard about it weeks later from an acquaintance who looked embarrassed even repeating it. Priya thanked her and changed the subject. She did not tell Carter. She did not tell Mira. She filed it away. When Priya became pregnant in the third year of the marriage, Diane arrived the next Sunday with a gift bag, a smile, and that particular tone some people use when they want cruelty to pass as concern. "We're all hoping the baby takes after Carter's side in terms of drive and focus," she said. "Not that Priya isn't lovely. She's just, well." Carter said nothing. Priya passed the bread. That same afternoon, Diane casually mentioned that she had called a law firm on McKinney Avenue to ask whether Carter had ever been advised to sign a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. She framed it as practical. She said she simply wanted to make sure the family's assets were protected. What Diane did not know was that the firm she had called was Mira Shaw's. What Diane also did not know was that Mira had her call logged, reviewed, and noted before the end of business that same day. That evening, Mira phoned Priya. "Diane Whitmore called the office," she said. "She asked about a prenup." A pause. "She doesn't know what we hold." Another pause. "She won't find out from us." That was the whole conversation. Priya thanked her, hung up, and stood in the kitchen with one hand on the counter, feeling the child move gently inside her, and something colder, steadier, older than anger, settled into place in her chest. Rebecca Lane entered the story the way betrayal often does, through details too ordinary to announce themselves. A restaurant receipt from a table for two on a night Carter said he was in Austin. A phone charger in his car that wasn't his. The kind of clues women are told they imagine until the day they are proven right, and no one apologizes for the years of their restraint. Priya was not the sort of woman who searched phones or tracked locations. She was pregnant, tired, grieving, and still trying to believe distance could resolve itself if given enough time. She did what patient people often do when they love someone whose honesty is thinning. She waited longer than she should have, because waiting had once felt like dignity. Then one evening, Carter left his phone on the kitchen island while he went upstairs. It lit up as Priya reached past it. The preview showed a name, Rebecca. She picked up the phone, found the photograph in seconds, and saw a polished woman standing in what looked like a hotel lobby in Austin, smiling with the practiced ease of someone very comfortable in the role she was playing. Priya looked at the image for a few moments. Then she took a screenshot. Then she put the phone back exactly where it had been. She filled the kettle. She made tea. She sat at the table with one hand over the place where the baby pressed gently against her side. That night, while Carter slept, Priya sent a single text message to Meera Shah. "I think we're getting close." Meera replied the next morning, "I'll send the observers." Carter never knew what was being assembled around him. He never understood that the quiet woman beside him was not waiting helplessly for her life to collapse. She had been watching, documenting, learning the shape of the ground under their marriage. Patience, in the hands of the right person, is not surrender. It is preparation. The night of the gala made that preparation visible. After Carter struck her in front of the entire ballroom, Priya did not go home with him. She drove instead to her father's estate on Briarwood Lane, the house she had kept exactly as he left it. The lights were on their timers. The silence in the rooms was not empty silence. It had weight. Rajan's presence had always felt like that, something dense and quiet enough to alter the atmosphere. She moved through the dark house and into his study. His desk remained at the same angle to the window. His wooden chair from Chennai remained in its place, uncomfortable and grounding at once. She sat in it and let the pain on the side of her face remain simply a fact, not denied, not dramatized, just noted. There were more urgent things to do. The baby moved. Her daughter, steady now, no longer fluttering but pressing with intention. Priya laid a hand over her stomach and said nothing. There was nothing to say to Carter. The room had already said it. The photographer whose flash fired on instinct had said it. The witnesses Meera placed at the event had said it. The stillness of 200 people who watched and did nothing had said it. Explanation was unnecessary. Her father had taught her that once the card is on the table, the weakest thing you can do is talk too much around it. After a long while, Priya took the old business card from her coat pocket. Not yet, but soon. For 3 years, those words had been a mystery. Then, a promise. That night, sitting in her father's chair in her father's house, she finally understood them as instruction fulfilled. The hand had been full for years. She had only been waiting for the moment when the room would deserve to see it. At dawn, she called Meera. "Withdraw the investment," Priya said. "All of it, and file the equity disclosure." Meera did not waste words. "The board meeting?" "Tomorrow, if possible. The day after at the latest." A brief pause. "He hit you in front of the observers." "Yes. I have the photographs." "Good." That was all. Across the city, Carter woke to calls from his chief financial officer. By mid-morning, he learned that a bridge investment, critical to Whitmore Energy's refinancing structure, had been withdrawn. Billions disappeared from his deal architecture before markets opened. The notice cited an undisclosed conflict of interest. Carter spent hours making calls, escalating through assistants, investor relations desks, private numbers. anyone he thought still answered to the gravity of his name. Eventually, a junior associate, sounding deeply uncomfortable, told him the withdrawal had been authorized by the controlling signatory, and that all further inquiries would need to go through that signatory's legal counsel. Carter asked for the name. There was a pause. Priya Anand Whitmore. The board meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Carter arrived with his attorney and the stiff, brittle confidence of a man already beginning to realize that reality has been moving behind his back. Diane was already seated. The rest of the board filed in with the tense quiet of people who know something historic is about to happen and are afraid to be the first to acknowledge it. At exactly 2 o'clock, the conference room door opened. Priya walked in first. She wore a charcoal blazer over a dark dress. Her hair was pulled back simply. 7 months pregnant now, she moved without hurry, with the kind of calm that does not need to announce authority because authority is already built into its stillness. Meera Shah followed behind her, carrying a leather document case. Priya crossed the room and sat at the head of the table, Carter's chair. She placed both hands flat on the polished walnut surface and looked, first not at her husband, but at the board. That choice alone changed the room. Meera began the presentation without ceremony. She laid out the acquisition history year by year. The original capital injection through Meridian Basin Partners, the subsequent tranches through additional vehicles, the steady accumulation of equity across decades. All of it lawful, documented, and structured with breathtaking precision. Each page that crossed the table reframed Whitmore Energy's history. Each signature, each date, each filing quietly erased the mythology of Whitmore control and replaced it with truth. The board leaned forward. Carter went still. Then came the trust documents. The Anand Family Trust. Total current valuation, staggering. Holdings across the Permian Basin, the Gulf Coast Shelf, international licensing agreements, and, at the center of it all, the controlling equity stake in Whitmore Energy Group, transferred in full to Priya upon Rajan Anand's death. For 2 years, while she sat at Carter's dinners, passed bread at Sunday lunches, endured insults from his mother, and was quietly edged out of household decisions, she had already been the most powerful person connected to the company bearing his family name. Meera paused. Then she reached into the case one final time. The following material, she said, is presented for the board's assessment of conduct and leadership risk. She placed the photographs on the table one by one. 14 images, sequential, time-stamped, clear. The room saw Carter gripping his pregnant wife's wrist, pulling her toward him, striking her across the face, straightening his jacket, turning back to the stage. And in several images, visible in the background, were the designated observers Meera had arranged to be there, because documentation matters most when the powerful believe no one will challenge them. No one spoke. Diane's hand rose slowly to her throat. Carter's attorney set his pen down. And Carter, for the first time in the entire story, looked not angry, not defensive, not even outraged. He looked informed. It was the expression of a man finally seeing the shape of everything he had failed to understand. Priya had been there all along, in his house, at his table, inside his company, beside him in public. Quiet not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew exactly when saying it would matter most. He had mistaken restraint for dependence. He had mistaken grace for softness. He had mistaken inherited confidence for intelligence. And now, in a room full of people who had once orbited his authority, he understood that the center of gravity had never truly belonged to him. Priya met his gaze with the same calm she had carried through years of dinners, slights, absences, and underestimation. "You told 200 people," she said evenly, "that I just wear the jewelry." Then she closed the folder in front of her. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. The vote moved quickly. Carter's removal as CEO passed decisively. When it was over, Priya thanked the board members by name with quiet, almost old-fashioned courtesy. Then she picked up the business card she had placed beside her folder, the one from Chennai, the one no one else in the room would ever turn over and read, and slipped it back into her pocket. She stood. Mira rose beside her. Neither woman looked back as they walked out. The door closed behind them with a sound so soft it almost disappeared, but everyone in that room felt the finality of it. Consequences had already begun. They did not arrive noisily. Real consequences rarely do. They arrived with the cold efficiency of things prepared long in advance. Within days, Carter's termination was formalized. The refinancing collapsed without the Anand Bridge capital at its center. Partner banks withdrew. Legal advisors shifted tone. Calls stopped being returned. Rebecca Lane issued a statement through her attorney, severing all personal ties and citing concerns about Carter's conduct and character. It was clinical, polished, and devastating in its brevity. The kind of statement written by someone who had detached emotionally long before she detached publicly. Diane left voicemails. The first was composed. The second was less so. The third was quiet in a way Priya had never before heard Diane become quiet. Priya listened to all three in her father's study, then set the phone down and did not return the calls. There was nothing left to discuss. The conversation Diane had wanted to control for years had already ended in that conference room. Carter came once to the estate. He found the gate, rang the bell, asked to see her. Mira's assistant informed him that Ms. Anand was unavailable. He asked for how long. The assistant said she was unable to say. He sat in his car outside the gate for several minutes, then drove away. Priya never saw him. At that moment, she was inside, reviewing asset summaries, writing in the margins with her father's mechanical pencil, steady-handed, practical, composed. The bridge investment was later reinstated, but only after being fully restructured on Priya's terms. A new leadership team was assembled. Operational agreements were redrafted. Governance changed. Accountability changed. The company name remained. Whitmore Energy did not need a new name. It needed new control. And in truth, that control had always belonged to her. Weeks later, Priya gave birth to a daughter at Houston Methodist. The labor was long. The morning was gray. The nurse placed the baby on her chest and understood, by instinct or wisdom, that silence was the right kind of kindness. Priya held her daughter and looked at her for a very long time. Healthy, furious, alive, small in the way all miracles begin. She named her Arya, not as a statement, not as a tribute, simply because it was the name that felt true. A few weeks after that, on a pale spring morning, Priya carried Arya onto the back porch of her father's estate and sat in the wooden chair he had brought from Chennai years before. The sky above Texas stretched vast and indifferent and beautiful. Her daughter rested warm against her chest. Priya reached into the pocket of her robe and drew out the old business card. The edges had softened from years of being carried. She turned it over. Not yet, but soon. At last, she understood the full mercy of those words. Her father had known something the loudest people in every room never understand until it is far too late. The strongest position is often the one no one thinks to examine. Silence is not emptiness. Patience is not surrender. And being underestimated, if you survive it without breaking, can become a form of power so complete it does not need to raise its voice. But that power costs something. It costs years of being misread by people who confuse gentleness with weakness. It costs the exhaustion of carrying knowledge in stillness while lesser minds perform confidence around you. It costs restraint, timing, discipline, the ability to wait without decaying into bitterness. And when the moment comes, when the room finally deserves the truth, it asks only this of you: that you place the card on the table with steady hands, that you speak clearly, that you do not waste your strength explaining what the evidence already says. Priya had done exactly that. She looked down at her daughter, then at the pale morning sky stretching over everything her father had built and everything her child would inherit. Not only the assets, not only the holdings, not only the power, but the lesson. Never show the whole hand. Let them underestimate the cards. Priya pressed the business card once, gently, against her daughter's back, as if joining one love to another. Then she looked upward and spoke so softly the morning almost kept it for itself. "Now, Baba," she said.